Thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone who's helped make today happen, and that includes not just all of us speakers and commentators still to come, the organisers, FAB Research, and also support from DSM Nutritional Products, who have funded the DOLAB trials with a grant to the University of Oxford, and this programme has actually become the biggest programme that I know of anywhere in the world, actually, looking at the role of omega-3 in child behaviour and learning. But my job, quite quickly, while trying to stick to Lucy's rigorous time schedule, because she's a good timekeeper, is to give an overview of the background to these studies. And essentially, we know, and Dave has given us a wonderful overview, how bad the diets are that many children and adults are eating these days. We're also well aware, and the health services really emphasise this message, about the damage to physical health. We have conditions like type 2 diabetes now turning up in children and adolescents. Obesity is a very visible sign that all is not right with regard to the balance between food intake and energy expenditure. What we tend to ignore is that the brain is part of the body, and therefore the very same diet that is bad for bodies is bad for brains. So this particular article, we've had a lot of media coverage, not all of it responsible, for this research over the years, but essentially a rotten way to feed the children is indeed something that one could endorse. Now, we have problems with school behaviour in our communities. We have the World Health Organization predicting between 1990, their last review, and 2020, a 50% increase in child mental disorders, and conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, the autistic spectrum, appear to be on the increase. Now, I've used this slide for many years because this captures, better than almost anything else I've ever come across, the reality of these diagnostic labels. They overlap hugely. I started my research career, if one could call it that, looking into dyslexia, ADHD and related conditions. The overlaps between them are huge, and furthermore, there's no clear boundary with individual differences in the general population. So these are descriptions, is the other fact. They're not explanations. There are no objective tests for these conditions. And we've reached a situation where for some years now, 1 in 5 of all children in UK schools, primary and secondary, actually have special educational needs, mainly of these kinds. I'm not saying they're all being met with resources. We have major problems here, but 1 in 5 of our children are suffering from difficulties with their learning and or their behaviour. And so we've got a whole dimension here from minor individual differences through to, or minor difficulties in these areas, through to established medical type diagnoses like ADHD. Whereas Dave has emphasised, because of the way our evidence hierarchy works, the answer tends to be drugs as the first line, rather than any attention being paid to nutrition and diet. So I'm going to run you through why omega-3 fatty acids, as found in fish, seafood, and some algae, because that's actually where the fish get them from. Why this might be important for child behaviour and learning. I'm going to take you through the theory, then the evidence of association, correlational type data, and then the controlled trial evidence. So let's start with the theory. We've only known since the 1960s, good gracious, that omega-3 are essential nutrients. These fatty acids are as essential as vitamins and trace minerals, but we didn't even know that until the 1960s. It's extraordinarily recent. We need them to build a brain and nervous system in the first place, but because of dietary shifts that have taken place over really the last century, many people's diets, most people's diets, are not incorporating enough of the long-chain omega-3 to maintain either physical or mental health and performance. That's actually what abundant data show. Now, over time, we have, since evolution and our sort of hunter-gatherer ancestors, we've dramatically shifted the ratio of omega-6 to 3 in our diets. Far too much 6, not enough 3, in a nutshell, is what most of us are now getting. And this is really a consequence of industrialisation and the massive use of vegetable oils instead of those saturated fats from animal sources, things like the butter and the lard. In came the vegetable oils, they're very omega-6 rich. What nobody's really paid much attention to is that the human brain, if you ignore its water content, is actually 60% fat. So, if we're going to dramatically change the fat composition of human diets and expect it to have no consequences for human brains, then we really aren't thinking straight, or we are not taking into account the evidence that's there. Now, I won't go into any detail here, but there's a whole family of omega-6s, a whole family of omega-3s. And even with regard to the textbooks and the fats that they tell us are essential, now that we know. Linoleic acid is the simplest of the omega-6s, and it's the shortest chain, 18 carbons, 2 double bonds. With omega-3, again, alpha-linolenic acid is the so-called essential fatty acid, EFA. What I want to emphasise is that when it comes to biology, it is not those that are essential. It is actually the longer chain, more highly unsaturated fatty acids of each series. I've put into colour the ones that are most important for the brain, and if you watch the screen, let's hope the special effects work, they do, AA and DHA, arachidonic and docosahexaenoic acid, these in brain and nerve tissue in every species that's got a brain. That brain and its membranes, all the cells, AA and DHA are critical structural building blocks of brain and nerve cells. We've then got the 3 that just did a 12 for you. These you can think of as functional fats. The substances we make from them govern, among other things, your hormone balance, your blood flow, and your immune system function. And there isn't much about you, physical or mental, that isn't affected by those things. Is blood reaching the parts that it should? Is your immune system, defending you against whatever? And your hormone balance. So the balance of fats in our diet, this slide I just like to frighten people with. The substances we make from these fatty acids, they govern, as I say, almost everything about us. And yet we've gone and changed them by industrialising the food supply with no thought, it would seem, for the consequences. So, very broadly, the omega-6 derivatives are pro-inflammatory. Inflammation is at the root bottom of most of our degenerative physical health conditions, including heart disease. The derivatives of arachidonic are also pro-thrombotic, so increasing the tendency for blood clots and for the blood to coagulate. The counterbalancing fatty acids, the omega-3s, and particularly EPA, gives rise to anticoagulant, anti-inflammatory substances. There you have, in a nutshell, some rather major problems that follow from unbalancing these things in the diet. But we keep on finding, gracious me, even more substances. From DHA, substances called neuroprotectins. These literally help to protect brain cells from damage and cell death. Resolvins, from the long-chain omega-3, help resolve inflammation. And the endocannabinoids, the commonest receptor in the human brain, is in fact the cannabinoid 1 receptor. And most folk don't know, and they're certainly not taught in most medical courses I've come across, that it's arachidonic acid, that main omega-6, that gives rise to these. And now that further study has been looking at the ones we make from omega-3, oh gracious, from DHA, a substance that they've now nicknamed synaptomide. Without it, you can't make a synapse. Quite frankly, connections between brain cells and nerve cells. You need DHA to do this. So, the thing is, building the long-chain omega-3 and 6 we'd really need, this is poor for a whole host of diet and lifestyle factors that I haven't got time to go into. For a range of constitutional factors, the very young and the very old have trouble with this conversion, build-it-yourself process, that in theory humans do have this pathway. And there are also sex differences, quite frankly. Women of childbearing age have the advantage over anyone else when it comes to building long-chain omega-3 or 6 from the shorter chain versions. And genetic factors come into this too. Enzymes that do that conversion differ between individuals. But my main point is this conversion of the shortest chain, alpha-linolenic, simple omega-3, converting that to the omega-3 that we really need, EPA and DHA. This process is notoriously inefficient in humans. And when it comes to how much alpha-linolenic becomes EPA, it's less than 5%. Now, this is not a popular message with the vegetarians and vegans who are relying on their flax oil or don't want to eat fish and seafood. When it comes to conversion to DHA, this is really serious. Less than 1% of this critical omega-3. That's the conversion that you're going to get if you start with the shortest. So the short chain are not an effective substitute. The evidence is absolutely there. This is the scientific consensus reference on this. So in terms of what's happened to the diet, as I've said, we are awash really with vegetable oils, and those are giving us absolutely bucket loads of the short chain omega-6. We also get from meat and eggs and dairy an abundance of the one omega-6 that is particularly important for physical and mental health, arachidonic acid. Evening primrose is an interesting exception. The GLA that you find in that and some other seed oils, that's the odd one out amongst the omega-6s. So for any scientists who are going to quibble when I say that omega-6 are broadly pro-inflammatory or pro-thrombotic, there are some exceptions here, but I won't have time to go into that. With regard to omega-3, we have a problem even with the short chain, green leafy vegetables, seaweeds, algae, and a few nut and seed oils. These are not major parts of anyone's diet. And fish and seafood. These are the only natural, traditional foods, apart from some algae and seaweed, as I say, but those aren't very popular in Western-type diets. These are the dietary sources of EPA and DHA ready-made. Now, what do we need these fats for? As I've said, you need them for the structure of all brain cell membranes. In fact, 6 to 10% of the dry weight of your brain should be DHA. You need DHA, as I've said before, with regard to synapses. It's there in the membrane, and we also now know substances made from it help to make new connections between brain cells. The long-chain omega-3 also influence. There's a huge body of research to support this. Concentrations and the functioning of all conventional neurotransmitter, chemical brain signaling systems. Why is it that we're not, at the moment, teaching medics about nutrition and about the importance of these fatty acids before they reach for the drug prescription pads for drugs that will influence these sorts of chemical neurotransmitter pathways? For vision, again, omega-3, absolutely critical. A third to a half of your retina needs to be DHA if you're going to see properly. And this was my introduction, actually, to the importance of omega-3. I had been studying for some years visual and attentional problems in dyslexia and ADHD and related conditions, but you need DHA for your visual system to work properly. Now, here, if these videos are going to work for us, is an example of this. I'm going to show you two animals that are really litter mates. They've both been bottle fed. This is a water maze task. They've been in this little swimming pool, and they're supposed to know where the platform is to get them out of the water. Now, this little fellow has had DHA in his bottle milk, and that really didn't take him long to find the platform. I want you now to watch what happens to his litter mate, whose bottle milk did not contain the DHA. And in this classic visual memory task, I know your heart goes out to him, and we all identify with that panic. Where is it? I know that it's around here somewhere. Or the, where did I leave my car keys? I'm late, whatever it is. And I do assure you they fish them out before they get, oops, he's just bumped into the platform and found his way out. Right, that, again, a picture, let alone a video, is worth 1,000 words. That exemplifies for you the impact on visual memory. There's an abundance of literature here. Without omega-3, you don't develop a good visual and attentional and spatial memory. So we need these fats during brain development. In fact, to build the brain, and also for the first 2 years of life, you see this continued accretion of DHA. But that means it's got to be in the diet. It's got to be in mum's diet when she's carrying that child during pregnancy, and it needs to be in that child's diet as it and its brain grow. Here is a really graphic illustration of the effects of a lack of DHA on brain connectivity. Spot the difference. There are 50% fewer synapses in the brain of this embryo whose mother did not have DHA in the diet. This is quite frightening. This is half the connections in that brain and nerve network. we've got a lot of human beings who might well be in that situation. Now, to maintain brain function throughout life, as I've emphasised, essentially we need these substances and substances we make from them for our blood flow, our immune function, for our hormone balance, and a host of other things. Now, the evidence of association of things going together, that a lack of omega-3 in pregnant mums' diets, that's been linked. If they don't eat fish and seafood during pregnancy, then the children have lower intelligence at the age of 8, and that is controlling for 27 other variables known to affect childhood intelligence. This is the Big Birth Cohort study. Motor control, they found the same thing for ADHD-type symptoms as well. We've also got a range of studies now that are the kind of classic case control study. Let's compare a group of children with ADHD or some similar condition, dyslexia, with controls, low blood omega-3. This is a brain imaging study from the States, and this one's quite interesting because in normal, healthy boys aged between 8 and 10, about the age of our DOLAB children, just a tiny bit older, they were randomised and given either a moderate dose of DHA, 400 milligrams a day, a high dose of DHA or placebo. And after 8 weeks, their brains were imaged again. Greater activation in frontal cortex and other areas known to be important for attention and cognition and executive function from the omega-3 DHA. Now, the evidence of causality. If we give more omega-3, and as Dave said, these are the trials that must be done given the current hierarchy of evidence, randomised, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. They are expensive, they are difficult to do, and funding for them is in very short supply, particularly given the patent issues that Dave alluded to so elegantly. But there have been a range of studies looking at children with ADHD and related conditions, of which the biggest to date is still our Oxford-Durham study. Now, these were children with DCD, developmental coordination disorder, but I should emphasise, we put that diagnosis on them. They were simply underachieving kids in schools until we descended with our testing. But yep, they all met criteria for difficulties with motor coordination. When we bothered to test for these things too, 40% were actually dyslexic and 30% had ADHD symptoms that put them in the clinical range. Not one of these children had actually received any of these diagnoses before we did the study. We found significant improvements in their reading and spelling. They'd been 2 years behind their classmates when this study began, and in just 3 months, they basically made 3 times the normal rate of progress, and they doubled their spelling progress. Compared with the placebo kids, that is a highly significant but also meaningful improvement. We also saw improvements in their ADHD-type symptoms, better able to concentrate, less hyperactivity, less impulsivity, but this was a secondary measure. So it wasn't in our main paper, but we found, significant improvements in their working memory, which we decided to follow up with the DOLAB study. The meta-analysis that came out just a couple of years ago, this, again, in our hierarchy of what we sometimes call evidence-biased medicine, this basically does show a modest but overall benefit of omega-3 for ADHD symptoms, which is why I find it galling that the official setters of guidelines, nice and sign, will still say there isn't any evidence. Well, there is actually. And what about the general school population? Because this is the issue. Have we got more children out there who might benefit from more omega-3 in the diet? There's been, before DOLAB, just one study that attempted to address this. It involved a reasonable number of children, 450 children, aged 8 to 10 from mainstream schools in Wales. 16 weeks of treatment with a reasonable dose of fish oils, it was, EPA, DHA or placebo. But they really didn't find much, although teachers' ratings of attention were the one measure where there was a significant improvement. Now, studying what happened here, they were taking all children, unselected, and I have to say, I think there's a major conceptual problem here to expect that a child who is already reading at the top of the scale could possibly improve, or to expect any child who's not omega-3 deficient to benefit when you give them some. These are the kinds of issues that I think need to inform our trial design. We won't know for sure, of course, why this study didn't show a great deal, but that went into, because we were aware of that before it was published, that went into the planning of our DOLAB study. I shall say no more about that, because we need a break now. except to say this question of might an increase in the intake of long-chain omega-3, and particularly DHA, benefit children in general, was the primary question of the DOLAB studies. And we decided to focus on children who had room to improve on the outcomes of interest. Now, just to close, because it'll save on any questions on this, the scientific consensus is that, quite frankly, against the background of a modern Western diet, about 0.5 gram a day of the long-chain omega-3 is needed for a healthy heart. We don't have good evidence yet for what the brain really needs, but there's a emerging sort of converging evidence is pointing to it might be as much as 1 gram a day. And that's actually a treatment recommendation for depression and related conditions from the American Psychiatric Association, gram a day of long-chain omega-3. But to put that in context, this is the kind of intake that most adults and children in the UK and other countries are getting. This is way below what's needed for a healthy heart, let alone a healthy brain. Just to finish with what Dave's emphasised, food, of course, comes with a whole package of things. So when you look at association studies and fish consumption, be aware it isn't just omega-3. There's a lot of other valuable nutrients in there. So I hope in this whiz summary I've been able to convince those of you who don't know already, adequate long-chain omega-3 and particularly DHA are essential for the brain to develop and function normally, but we don't get enough in our diets. Cognitive and behavioural problems in children are associated with a low maternal intake of omega-3 DHA during pregnancy, and we've also got a lot of studies showing associations between low blood DHA and conditions like ADHD, etc. And in controlled trials of children with these sorts of conditions, we do have some evidence of benefit, but studies in the general population were needed. That was the rationale for DOLAB. Thank you very much for your attention. I think it's time for coffee.